Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the August 11th, 2022 edition of Collect Our Cousins, Engaging White People in the Struggle for Full Democracy. I'm Karen Fleshman, founder of Racy Conversations and of the Collect Our Cousins weekly live stream. I created this program to help white Americans like me become more effective in our conversations with white people in our lives, to help us build an embodied anti-racist white culture, in the words of Resma Menachem. I'm featuring the people who inspire and teach me the most, like Steve Phillips. White Americans, the battle for our democracy will not be won in courtrooms or in the streets. It must be won in our living rooms, at neighborhood meetings, school board meetings. As an anti-racist, collecting my cousins often falls to the end of my to-do list. Oh, I'll get to that next week. But I want to encourage everyone watching to write a list of your friends and family you will collect this year. There are 21 million Americans, largely white, who believe that Donald Trump is the legitimate president and political violence may be necessary to restore him. And we are frontline in convincing them otherwise, or if we can't reach and teach them, convincing the folks who are in the middle or leaning toward our side. And that is why I am so delighted that Steve Phillips is joining us here today for a great edition of Collect Our Cousins. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad you're doing these conversations. It's certainly a very important topic and challenge facing our country, and I'm glad to participate in it in any way I can.
Thank you so much. Could you share a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Well, how much time do you have? but so I'm a writer and an activist, and I guess those two things kind of span much of what I've done in various settings over the past, very many years. I mean, I'm literally a child of the civil rights movement. I wasn't born actually, but I grew up in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. My family desegregated our neighborhood. The person who owned the house wouldn't sell it to my parents because they were Black. And so we had to get a white lawyer, Byron Krantz, to buy the house and deed it over to my parents. My brother was the first Black student at local elementary school. And as a child, I read all the biographies of Martin Luther King in the elementary school library. One of my first memories was actually seeing Dr. King when I was like 3 or 4 years old when he came to Cleveland. And my grandfather was a minister in Cleveland, Glenville Church of God. And so I had these long-standing dual interests, politics and civil rights. And then for me, in 1984, when Jesse Jackson ran for president, it was a very transformative moment because it really brought together civil rights and electoral politics and brought that energy and movement into the electoral sphere. And I like to say I've been trying to build the small R rainbow ever since. And this concept of a new, when the old minorities come together, they comprise the new majority. So I've been working on that in various forms, organizations I've created over the years. And then when Obama won, that really, to me, proved the case that there was, in fact, a new American majority. I was quite alarmed that people didn't, yes, brown is the new. So I wrote Brown is the New White because people did not fully understand and appreciate the underlying significance of what Obama's election is. Like, oh, he's a unique figure, and it's a one-off that he won. But it wasn't. Obama would not have beaten Reagan. That the country wasn't diverse enough. You take the Obama coalition, 80% people of color and 40% of whites, that wouldn't have been enough to beat Reagan. But the country continued to diversify over the years. So anyway, it's a long way of saying I've been doing this work around trying to advance the political and social change around making this country a multiracial, multicultural democracy, which is still very much a tentative and unproven proposition, even at this late date of this country's age. So,
Yes, and thank you for all your work. I highly encourage everyone to subscribe to Democracy in Color podcast. Get your new book that's coming out. Read this book. This book gave me so much hope and inspiration and guidance as to what I should be doing. And I feel like we're at this real inflection point, right? Where the white supremacy, which is structural in the United States, and when we talk about the Constitution, the Electoral College, the disproportionate political power of majority white, sparsely populated states, as we see in the Senate and what they're able to do in terms of Supreme Court confirmations and you know, kind of skewing the country's policy in a direction that is opposed to the interests of the new American majority. And then with each passing year, the new American majority is growing in size.
Right. Yeah. No, we're very much at an inflection point, and this is really going to be the challenge of this period. And so, I guess my team would be remiss if I didn't mention that I have another book coming out that I've been working on. So, How We Win the Civil War will be out this fall, and it really talks about this inflection point. So the publisher came to me in 2020, so do you want to write another book? And I was like, well, yeah, what? Maybe we should try to frame this moment in time using the Civil War as a metaphor. And then 8 months later, the people stormed the United States Capitol carrying the Confederate flag and wearing T-shirts saying MAGA Civil War. And so I was like, well, it's not so metaphorical anymore. So it's very much just, and it was fascinating writing this book and realizing, and then starting to see the parallels to this current moment, that the Civil War itself began with a significant but not majority section of the country refusing to accept the election results of the presidential election. So Lincoln was elected in 1860. And first they tried to assassinate him before he even could take office. And he was elected in 1860, supposed to take office, and that time was March 1861. And then that is when the states began to secede from the Union, because they refused to accept that the non-racist person had been elected president of the country. So the parallels are profound in terms of where we're at. This battle over, is this going to be a multiracial democracy, or is this going to be a white nationalist nation, continues to rage to this day. And it's we don't appreciate how close we actually came to tipping over into literal fascism when a country throws out the democratic election results, keeps an autocratic ruler in power who lost the election. How is that anything other than fascism? And that was really, the majority of Republicans in Congress voted for that on January 6th. So the solidity and the stability of this democracy is very much up in the air. And this is really going to be a critical period of time around, are we in fact going to protect and defend and expand the concept that this is a multiracial, multicultural democracy? And I do think there's a very critical, fundamental role for progressive white people to play. And so that's really, I'm glad you're having these conversations, and glad to contribute any kind of lessons that I've learned that might be useful to people.
Sure. And folks, if you're listening into our conversation and want to pose a question to Steve, please put that in the chat. We would love to engage with your questions. As you were talking, it really evoked for me listening to Brian Stevenson in the summer of 2020. And he was in conversation with Kimberly Crenshaw. And he was talking about how in Germany, after the Holocaust, the Germans put the Nazis on trial. They paid reparations. They made their history books very clear. They did not, there's not a statue anywhere in Germany of any Nazi. There's, the concentration camps are, uh, are places to visit with historically accurate information. And German school children are taught that Nazism is wrong. Whereas in the United States, after our Civil War, it was more of an attitude of, let's let bygones be bygones. And for a period of time, there was like 40 acres and a mule, an attempt and during Reconstruction to repair. But then there was a huge backlash to that and a resurgence of white power after that. And then the formation of the Ku Klux Klan and all of that greatly expanded after Birth of a Nation, and then United Daughters of the Confederacy, and this whole attempt to rewrite history and make it sound like slavery wasn't that bad, and we're all good people and white people should be in charge. So I'm just bringing that up because do you feel like we ever fully resolved the Civil War originally, or have we been in a protracted civil war since that time?
No, we never. I mean, that's the fundamental first premise of my book, of the new book, is that the Confederates never stopped fighting. And it's not even metaphorical. And both of these things took place. Why this moment also takes place. So the first is about the Confederates have never stopped fighting. And yeah, it's like there's so much. I mean, a lot of information is hard to appreciate and lift up. But like everybody knows, obviously Lincoln was assassinated, but I didn't fully appreciate when he was assassinated and why he was assassinated. So he was assassinated 5 days after the Confederates supposedly surrendered at Appomattox. And so how is that surrendering when you go and shoot the president in the back of the head? And there's historical record that the John Wilkes Booth was at the one speech that Lincoln gave as president after being elected, and he talks about extending the vote, at some level to African Americans. And John Wilkes Booth says to a person, "That's N-word citizenship. That's the last speech he'll ever give." And then he went and murdered the president of the United States. And so that's not surrendering. And so then I take that all the way, document how there's been a very consistent Confederate battle plan ever since the end of the Civil War. So we're looking at never give an inch, ruthlessly rewrite the rules and the laws, distort public opinion, silently sanction terrorism, and play the long game. And that has been a consistent strategy up to today. And so we've got that piece. But what's also critical is that, and I think it does get into the role and the challenge, I think, for progressive whites, is the ambivalence around holding to account the people who had gone to war. And it would be it would be the equivalent. And it's not the equivalent. It's like we think about like the tensions and what do they call the polarization and whatnot. If hundreds of thousands of people were killed by other Americans over the whole issue around not just slavery, but sort of the identity of the country and who was in charge and are white people in charge. And that really is in essence what that was all about. But there was tremendous ambivalence to the extent of Congress had nobody from the South in it because they had all succeeded. So there was no Confederates in the Congress immediately after the Civil War. And they could not pass the 13th Amendment to outlaw slavery.
Mm.
It took multiple votes and amendments to be able to pass the amendment just outlawing slavery just among the North, because they did not want to alienate the South. They didn't want, they were their friends. They wanted to bring them back into the fold, etc. And then ultimately that played itself out. And then it had similar fights over 14th and 15th Amendments, but it played itself out in terms of the ultimately returning control of the South to the Confederates in the 1870s and 1880s, where they reimposed, legalized segregation for 100 years.
Mm.
But that was allowed to occur because there was not the fortitude on the part of the whites who had opposed slavery, but were not prepared to go the next step for accountability and justice for the
Mm.
people who had tried to destroy democracy. And so we're in a very similar moment. What's going to happen with the January 6th hearings, right? The raid on Trump's house. He's like, this is unprecedented. I was listening to this podcast while I was born. It's like, it is unprecedented. What's also unprecedented is the president of the United States trying to overthrow the elected government of the United States. That's unprecedented. And so are we going to have a level of accountability, justice, defend our democracy? We've got all these democracy laws, all this voter suppression is passed, very little resistance and very little outrage from people within the country. And so that, I think, is the challenge in the moment that we're in. Conflict is not, welcomed by people, but we're in a conflict, and everybody has to step up and engage in actually trying to win this and solidify and fortify the fact that we want this to be a multiracial, multicultural democracy.
Mm. Wow, so many threads there. I was thinking about the economic self-interest and investment in white supremacy as you spoke, because at that same period, the Andrew Jackson period, is when my great-grandfather migrated from France to Western Nebraska and obtained 160 acres of land through the Homestead Act, for which he paid $60. And that land is still in my family's possession. It's where my mother grew up. It's the reason why she got a college degree, became a homeowner. It's the reason I got a college degree and became a homeowner. And how all of that was very much done, I think, to create that ambivalence, right? Because as long as I have a great place to live and I have this myth that I deserve it all because of my hard work, and then it's, why would I step up and say, hey, we need to disrupt the system, this is being unfair?
Yeah, no, there's a whole piece about, and it's like who is it? You get these like Black conservatives who are like, people need to work hard and pull themselves up by their bootstrap, like Ben Carson would talk about. Says, well, my mom was poor and she didn't have these, undisciplined traits. And I'd love to ask these people, why was your mom poor? Right? Is it because she was lazy? Or if you start to, you don't have to trace it back too far to actually start to see how there was and why there is a racial wealth gap, profound racial wealth gap in this country, where average white family has 10 to 12 times more assets than the average Black or Latino family. And it's assumed that, it's hard work, or I did my, sacrifice or whatever. But it's these types of public policy decisions over the years that have created this, starting with slavery, people creating wealth and giving it to white people and not getting any of it themselves. And then again, the 100 years of, this the other thing about, I began to appreciate more writing my first book. It was entirely legal to discriminate in hiring and employment and promotion all the way up to 1964. And so we think that Brown versus Board of Education in 1956 eliminated legalized segregation, but it was limited to education. And it was very explicitly limited to education. So people could hire just white people completely legally up until 1964. So that's a long way of saying there's multiple periods in history that are responsible for creating the racial wealth gap. The GI Bill, which is remarkably little amount of information about it, but basically GI Bills, the government took billions of dollars and handed it to white people, and we don't actually fully appreciate that. It was like a fifth of the population in terms of the veterans and their families who benefited from that. So anyway, I think that Homestead Act fits within there. So there's definitely the who has the money and who doesn't have the money is not a reflection of merit and talent. It's a reflection of public policy and a racially focused public policy. I want to say something about kind of what you raised in your opening, but in terms of as I think about the role of white people and what can be done and most helpful. And while I appreciate people trying to change the minds of people who don't actually, I don't know how efficacious that is. And I think my fundamental point of Brown is the New White is that there's a set number, what I call a meaningful minority of whites who are progressive, and it's documented. I mean, if you look at, I just did a piece the other day, went back and looked at the voting for the exit polls showing the votes for president over the past almost 50 years, back to 1976. And that on average, 40% of whites have voted Democratic. It's fluctuated from Carter got 48, but it's come down ever since then. Never been a majority. But it's been a consistent minority. Even McGovern got, this is before the exit poll, but roughly he got 32, 33%. So somewhere in the low 30s to 40%. Now, but that's, historically, I talk about politics was a contest between white people. And so you had progressive whites, conservative whites fighting over whites in the middle, trying to construct a majority. And progressive whites were never large enough themselves to be a majority. They had to get some sector of those in the middle. But now there's so many people of color in the country. People of color were 12% of the country in 1965, 40% today. And so there are so many people of color that progressive whites allied with people of color is the majority of people within the country. And so we don't necessarily, so in terms of time, energy, and effort, I don't know how much impact is going to come from just trying to change the minds of people who really deeply believe that this should be primarily a white country. Now, the challenges, and what I would challenge people around, is to identify and support particularly those people of color who are advancing change. And that's the second part of what I try to lay out in my the upcoming book, How We Win the Civil War, is case studies of where we have won. So, but I have the title, the Georgia chapter, Georgia, that's not one we expected. That's the quote from Joe Biden on election night. Oh, we're still in the game in Georgia. That's not one we expected. But if you knew that Stacey Abrams had been doing the work for a decade, building New Georgia Project, building Fair Fight, running herself, building the Democratic Party there, keeping all of that together, that she had laid the foundation to be able to flip that state. Similarly in Arizona, that they were able to, they passed this in 2010, the Show Me Your Papers bill, which is really a modern day manifestation of the slave catching laws. But it radicalized a group, of young people, largely young people of color, and activated them, sent them into become activists and organizers. And they spent a decade organizing, registering people to vote. It's bringing hundreds of thousands of Latinos into the electorate. And that's what enabled Arizona to flip for Biden and for Mark Kelly. But those people and those groups and those leaders are underfunded, underappreciated, underinvested in. And that is the challenge that I would pose to progressive whites, is to move your resources and your cachet and your credibility, whatever platforms you have, to support and elevate those people of color doing the work in these key places and key states. And that we now have evidence works in terms of winning and changing the country. But all of those groups and all of those leaders are under supported. But I think that there's a role for the progressive white community to play in terms of lifting them up and backing them.
Is there like a central place for progressive whites to go to resource these folks, or how can we support them directly?
Well, there's not. I mean, it's an interesting question. Something maybe we should even think about going forward around what that would look like. So, I mean, I can mention the ones who are that I feature in the book, and so it's 5 states, and it's all places that were formerly conservative, if not actual Confederate bastions. I mean, I talk about Harris County, Texas, where Houston is. I open up talking about Sam Houston, who was a slaveholder and the president of the Republic of Texas in 1830s, 1840s. And the Republic of Texas was created because they wanted to be able to hold Black people in slavery, and the Mexican government wouldn't let them. Mm-hmm. And so they're like, well, we're going to, rebel and create this, independent piece of Texas. But Texas is now run by a Black man, and the county, the head of the county is a Latina, Lina Hidalgo. So there are, I'm trying to think if we have distilled this at Democracy in Color yet, and we probably should, kind of as we're talking about it here. But I would just mention these different places, and people. So Georgia, Arizona, Texas, Virginia, and San Diego, California, San Diego, and the Inland Empire part of California. Even the people looking at the taking back or holding Congress this year, there are 6 Republican-held congressional seats that could be flipped to Democrats this year by virtue of expanding turnout of voters of color in the Central Valley of California and Southern California, et cetera. So those are the states and places. So then the groups, there's 2 coalitions in Arizona, one Arizona and Arizona Wins, constellations of the organizations doing the work. In Texas, Texas Organizing Project has been the anchor organization for a decade, driving the work there. Georgia, New Georgia Project, and the America Votes grouping in Georgia. Virginia, New Virginia Majority, and in San Diego, Alliance San Diego. And so these are the organizations that I feature within the book, and they've been the ones doing the work for a decade. And so there are others in other parts of the country. And so we should think about how to distill that. Florida New Majority is doing a lot of similar type of work. There's new organizations coming together in North Carolina, trying to advance similar types of work. But those are some of the key places and people. And I feature those groups because they have actually won. And so it's not this. That's the thing. Somebody was asking me what I was excited about the book, and it's like, well, we've always been told, like, oh, yes, the people of color stuff is fine, but we want to win, and so we have to focus on the numbers. I'm like, well, no, we won. We won Georgia. We won Arizona, right? And so we won in these different places, but it's not valued and appreciated. And so I feature those places that have actually proven that you can prevail and that you can transform something. So but all of them, again, are still under-resourced, underappreciated, and could use the backing of a much wider grouping of people.
Yes. Jill Nagel is saying she and her partner have been talking a lot about how the Civil War never ended. We have Ulrike joining us from Germany. Watching from Germany, it makes me sick how Trump turned the U.S. into a banana republic. What else has to come until he ends in jail? Well, we did make some significant headway this week. Edward Jones with the National Museum of African American History and Culture Reconstruction exhibit. He encouraged us to look at that. And Ulrike continues her comment, and the GOP has to be finally exposed as a racist organization of oligarchs only interested in raising money from stupid white people that haven't enough to eat. I have a biracial son, and my friends in the US are afraid of their biracial kids being discriminated against and always being fearful of being killed by the police.
Yeah, I mean, you had mentioned Germany as well, and I mentioned in the conversation with somebody I had from Germany in my book about this woman who ran Ashoka nonprofit out here. So she had come from Germany. It just always stuck with me. So told me this like 10 years ago. It's just that in Germany, as you were saying, there's a national sense of shame about the Holocaust. They teach it. They try to, really imbue the values and try to avoid that happening. And it was notable that she said, in the United States, there's no shame. And I'll take it even further. It's not even that there's no shame. They're trying to celebrate the actual Confederates. You mentioned the United Daughters of the Confederacy. I have a long section in the book, my book, about the United Daughters of the Confederacy. For one, how this whole thing about attacking critical race theory, being anti-racist education, is not new. And so it was begun by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They finally, last year, right, just took down this huge statue to Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia, which went up decades before the Lincoln Memorial. There was great resistance. So Lincoln was killed in 1865. Lincoln Memorial didn't get set up to like 1930 or 1920s, 1930. And so there was all this resistance to actually honoring the man who had actually ended slavery. And so the celebration of the white nationalism, Confederate flag, our culture, our heritage, far from a question of having any sense of shame. And I think about that. This is another thing I do think in terms of with role, I think what different white people can do, because the whole this whole critical race theory debate took place without sufficient being engagement and sufficient pushback, and really highlighting and calling out how much this is really an attempt to whitewash history within the country, right? So to go back to the United Daughters Confederacy, they have they have this thing called the Children of the Confederacy. You can go to their website now, today, United Daughters of the Confederacy. You can Google them, go to their website. You'll see that they have a thing for Children of the Confederacy, a drop-down menu, where they have, and then it's also in their IRS tax records, where they give scholarships to young people. And that to get this, you have to recite this catechism about which actually says, it's like this call and response piece, right? So what was the purpose of the slavery, of the Civil War? They wouldn't let us alone. Were the slaves treated badly? No, they weren't. And so this is what they're teaching children to actually recite up until this day. And the catechism used to say, I contacted the person who did her dissertation on it, and a 300-page dissertation, and she had gotten a hold of many of them over the years. The United Daughters of the Confederacy Catechism in the 1930s used to say, did we kill many Northerners? And the correct answer was yes, thousands and thousands of them. And so they were encouraging young people to celebrate the murder of anti-slavery soldiers within the Civil War. And so that organization continues to be, they're 700 chapters, United Daughters of the Confederacy, around the country. There's a parallel organization, Sons of Confederate Veterans, that has a online store. You can buy Confederate belt buckles. You can buy all this different paraphernalia, and so the celebration of white nationalism and the notion that this should be a white nationalist country continues apace.
Mm.
But there's a role to be played to call that out, to shame it, and to push back. And so that's where this, the attacks on critical race theory, I think that all that we should force people to own this Sons of Confederate Veterans, United Daughters of Confederacy history and activity, and to disavow it. And that, but too much of that work is allowed to flourish, frankly, without criticism and without critique, and then they benefit from it politically. But I feel there's a role to inject that into the public policy debate, into the political space, and I do think that there's a role that progressive white people can play in that regard.
Yes, definitely. I have felt it so strongly this summer. Every time I go outside of San Francisco, I see so many, especially white men, wearing the no quarter given Black American flag baseball cap or T-shirt or other kind of hateful imagery, like on the stickers on cars, the Trump flags, the Let's Go branded. Like there's so many um, visual manifestations of white supremacy everywhere. And so when I go in these spaces, I wear my Let's Make Racism Wrong Again hat, and I have my stickers on my car. But I feel like we have to counter the takeover of public space with this visual manifestation of white supremacy.
And I think it's and there's I keep forgetting her name, but there's somebody who's done this whole report and book and analysis about racism is most powerful when it's implicit and understated.
Mm.
And when it's explicit and front and center, it's less powerful. But many progressives, certainly most Democrats, don't grasp that and appreciate it. They don't want to talk about it because they're afraid that they'll lose support. They don't want to call it out. But by calling it out, what actually reduces it, because everyone says, "Oh, no." It's like, was it Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote this column several years ago after whatever latest incident of racism. This person was like, "Well, I'm not racist," and he says, "Who does the guy have to lynch around here to get called a racist?" Is that
okay? I'm sorry, that's funny, but it's
well, it is funny because he, the sense of understanding this piece, and so
well, this is white people. We have all been conditioned into white supremacy. There is no shame in that. That's like we were taught that from childhood. Even, my parents were very progressive, open minded people, taught me racism is terrible. Dr. Martin Luther King is wonderful. And the way to not be racist is be colorblind and treat everybody the same, while at the same time teaching me that the reason for racial inequality is that some families choose to work really hard, and that's why we have what we have, and other families choose not to, and that's why they're in the situation that they're in. Like, I think that's what about 80% of white people are telling their kids today. So this is the conversation. This is why I pointed out what Anne Shu said on her questionnaire, because what she said is exactly what many, 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 many people believe and are telling their kids. And this is the conversation that we need to be having, not let's cancel this person, let's cancel that person in some kind of tennis match. But what is racism? And what do we do to unlearn these fundamental beliefs held by very well educated? I mean, I went to Mount Holyoke College, I went to law school. I did not unlearn these beliefs until I was sitting across the table with my mentees. And that's when I realized, dang, I have a lot of harmful assumptions and stereotypes.
Right, and it's across the board, right? I think that hopefully most men learned something during the whole Me Too period as well, right? I mean, that was the power of that hashtag, was that it educated people. And I remember that my friends would be commenting, "This happened to me on the bus," and etc. And I was all like, "Really?" And so it was like very educational. I think in a similar fashion, racism is equally pervasive in terms of, so it's not surprising that that would affect everybody. But I think the thing that I'm saying also is that I think there's a role to play to inject the reality of racism into more of the public conversation, and frankly into the public policy and the political conversation, and force people. When I talk about the Confederate battle plan, much of this about is it silently sanctioning terrorism.
Mm.
And so, 1964, Freedom Summer in Mississippi. People came from all over the country to voter registration in Mississippi. And Schwerner, Goodman, Cheney were disappeared and killed. The two white Jews and an African American. And so it became a national cause, and celebrated, but very known place as the centerpiece of the battle around racial justice within this country. Ronald Reagan, when he ran for president in 1980, kicked off his presidential campaign in the county where Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney were killed.
Mm.
And he knew what he was doing. Bob Herbert at the Times had a column where he talks about it. He was clearly sending a message around what side he was on and who he was for, etc. So that's an example of the silently sanctioning terrorism, right? People lose that from the Trump period, and again, so much happens, it's hard to track it all. And that is the advantage of the luxury I had, being able to think it through, write a book, try to connect the dots. And so the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh, where the white man in Pittsburgh went to the synagogue, Tree of Life synagogue, and murdered multiple people. That happened in October of 2018.
18.
He had been watching the news where Trump was talking about the caravan of immigrants coming from Central America. And there was a drumbeat that week of Trump talking about it, and then the Homeland Security people talking about this caravan is coming. It's coming to America. What are we going to do? How are we going to stop it? How are we going to block it? And there was a group in Pittsburgh that had been somewhat associated with trying to do immigrant relocation, etc. And that's what made him connect that up to Tree of Life. And then he's like, screw the optics, I'm going in. And this was all fed by Trump's rhetoric. So people benefit politically. And so I feel like, can we find places and can we force whatever party the people are who are benefiting from and who are like winking and nodding at the racism, the white nationalism, the public policies, the anti race conscious education periods. But I read this thing, particularly in places like Texas and Florida, where they're passing all these anti-CRT laws. There could be people could do it from wherever around the country. So they're banning books explicitly by different writers of color. So why don't we have a national fund and book drive to get those books and send them to people in Texas and those areas, and to do that in a way that gets, let the media know about it. It generates a whole sense that there's a whole piece. Can we get different, people, if not celebrities, to go do public readings of these banned books, right? To
I love
challenge
this idea.
them and get into their face in this regard. So that's kind of what I think is my fundamental. I'd say two things. One is, I think, in terms of what I feel in terms of the contribution, the way people can make at this point in time, is one is to be much more visible voices around anti-racism and pro multiracial democracy, and standing up for that and championing it, and kind of being on the front edge, front lines of it. And so it's a whole different thing when a white person is saying, no, this is racist, than when a person of color is again having to make that argument. And then the other piece was what I was saying, is really trying to rally as many white people as possible to back the groups and leaders of color who are doing the frontline work to transform these places. And so that's the I think those are two key pieces. And I do think that also is having a big social change impact, right? I mean, my wife and I have been supporting Stacey Abrams since 2012. We helped her raise the first $20,000 of the $54,000 she raised for her PAC in 2012. And so she called me in 2021 after the Senate was installed and they had passed the first COVID relief package. And I said, so you took that first $20,000 we helped you raise and you've turned it into $2 trillion to the American people? She did the work that flipped Georgia, that flipped those 2 Senate seats, which flipped the control of the Congress, and which made all of this possible. She says, I like to provide return on investment. So, but that's the type of thing that's possible. All of this stuff, we're Paul Krugman's column is, the Democrats just saved civilization with this Inflation Reduction Act and the climate bill that passed. None of that would have been possible without the voter registration, mobilization, organization work in Georgia that enabled control of the Congress to flip. And that's just one example, and much more of that is possible. And that Texas can be flipped, Florida really should be far more progressive, North Carolina. But the people, groups, and leaders doing that work need to be backed, supported, and elevated.
Thank you so much. This has been such a robust conversation, Steve, full of so much insight and inspiration and hope. I think it's really easy to fall into doom scroll and there's nothing I can do. But I think about the abolitionists and how they knew that they were not going to see the end of slavery in their lifetime, but they kept at it. And they were raising their kids to continue the struggle after them. And it was an intergenerational struggle. And I, who am I to say, oh, this is hopeless and I give up? But great people like yourself give us such a path forward and such great analysis. And we are the majority. That's what I keep telling. I'm like, there are more of us than there are of them. We just need to.
And then it goes all the way back, right? That the Confederates were not the majority, right? I actually went back and I counted. I was like, no, that's also why they were so focused on voter suppression. Georgia and South Carolina were majority Black after the Civil War. And so, of course, you have to suppress the vote if you're, a white Confederate at that point in time. So that goes back a long time. But similarly, after the Supreme Court decision on Dobbs and overturning Roe, there was such a sense of defeatism that it's like, that this country we live in, etc. The majority of the Supreme Court, particularly the Supreme Court, is not the same thing as the majority of the country. And this is a radical minority agenda that's being rammed through. And I think that Kansas reveals that. Even in places not necessarily as progressive as Kansas shows that the concept that this should be a multicultural democracy is a majority point of view. But we don't often carry ourselves that way. And then the other side, the minority is so ferocious. Even like the whole thing about the Trump, the FBI raid of his compound. They're like, well, it's upset people, and did we know that it's going to upset them? I'm like, well, Lincoln getting elected upset people too, but are we going to not advance? Are we going to not defend our country and hold people to account because it's going to make some people upset? But
Yes.
that's what I was really trying to get at in my book, is that this is a profound, intense battle that we are in. And so we have to
Yes.
orient ourselves that way. But we are, in fact, the majority. And so if we first get clearer in a fight and then conduct ourselves that way and then back those people who know how to win the fights, we can, in fact, win. So being at an inflection point, we are, but the inflection point could go the right way in terms of what we want to see. And then that can provide decades and decades of, positive benefits for this country and the world.
Yes. I think about the role of the Wide Awake movement and, John Brown and courageous white people who were saying slavery is wrong and we do need to go to war to end it. And we would not, that's what, I'm no historian, but I know that played a very important role in the North actually going to war.
Right. And all the people who were active in the Underground Railroad, right?
Yes.
And that really opened up their homes to people fleeing slavery. And so that gets back to my point, is that there's always been a meaningful minority of white people who have sided with the concept and the vision that this country should, in fact, be a multiracial democracy and have worked to have it exist. And so my view is that constellation doesn't get enough support and reinforcement and guidance around what they can and should be doing to manifest their influence and impact in the country.
Awesome. Well, that is exactly what the point of this series is. So we're so grateful to you, Steve, for joining us here today. If you could wave a magic wand and get white people to stop doing something or start doing something, what would it be and why?
Well, one of them is to support Stacey Abrams, right? So, and I do think that is a very significant on multiple different levels in terms of Stacey Abrams's campaign. In that, part of the reason, there's one of the books that was really important to me as I was writing my book was Isabel Wilkerson's Cast, and she talks about how we were all on a stage that was built long before we arrived. And it's been predetermined who plays what roles, and who is center stage, who is the sidekick, who is more in the margins. And so we've had 46 presidents in this country, all of them men, 45 of them white men. So the role of president is clearly reserved for a man, and generally a white man, conceptually. But Stacey Abrams is so not any of that's much part of her power, is that she embodies an entirely different conception. So there's that, just in terms of our psyche. Then in terms of the showing how social change and political change takes place, her being able to win proves that case and advances, and is going to make possible replicating that in all these other different states across the country. And her herself, I supported her for vice president as well, and it's entirely in the realm of possibility that she could become the president of this country. So in terms of this trajectory over the next decade or a couple decades, supporting her effort, but it's going to be it's an immense battle. And so I do think that is one particular specific thing, is trying to support Stacey Abrams. StaceyAbrams.com is her website, because all of what is attached to that is significant. And then I think at a more local or granular level, I do think there's a being more intentional and mindful of who we are backing. And so are there 2 or 3 local people, leaders of color, that you can support, whether it's volunteering with them, or $10 a month, or sending an email to your friends and family about this organization, and trying to become a ambassador or an investor in those types of leaders and those types of groups. So that is, I think, the critical work that's required. But again, those groups do not have the same level of respect for support and investment. But I think that you need people. I kind of thought about having cocktail party cachet, where someone says, "Oh, that person's brilliant," right? And so it's usually a white person that gets said about, even in the progressive space, in the democratic space. But people don't appreciate and don't back. One of the things I realized writing my book was how significant, because the data geek role on the national stage is reserved for white guys. It's like, oh, white guys working on their computers, etc. But I began to dig into the Montgomery bus boycott. I mean, think about, how would you, if you had to organize a carpool for, just say, 3 different houses in your neighborhood?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of logistically complicated, right? How many people, how many cars do you need? What time do they have to be picked up and get to where they're going to go? Imagine doing that for 40,000 people.
Wow.
That's what the Montgomery bus boycott was for an entire year. And so they added hundreds of cars, coordinated pickup points, drop-off points. That's a data genius. That's data sophistication. That's a data geek. But those people don't, again, they don't get celebrated and they don't get supported. And so that, I think, would probably be my fundamental thing. For one is back Stacey Abrams, but 2 is find somebody in your own circle and become their champion and their supporter, and stick with them and find out what they need, introduce them to people in your circle, even if it's a small local surrounding. That is the type of embedded minutia type work that a lot of the white leaders and the white progressive leaders get, but people of color, and in general, women of color in particular, don't get. And so that's something I think that could make a bigger difference. And it will also be rewarding because you're connecting with somebody, you're seeing them have an impact. So that's, I think that's my fundamental advice, is find someone of color, become their champion, and become their long-term champion.
Awesome. Steve, how can people connect with you? When is the book coming out?
So democracyincolor.com is the organization that I founded. We've got a weekly newsletter. You can sign up for the newsletter at democracyincolor.com. And then we'll be apprising people there about the book. The book comes out in October 18th is our publication date. You can pre-order now. That is a possibility. But I think the best way to stay in touch is to sign up at democracyincolor.com.
Thank you so much, Steve. This has been so rich and informative, and I know everyone really enjoyed listening to you. I work in graphic design, and yes,
Exactly.
there you go.
Exactly.
So much of media, advertising, communications is controlled by white men, and they're the gatekeepers determining, who should.
Right. So, but the 30%. So finding those people, championing them. Like I did something once where I helped somebody get to a conference. And so, they need like a few $100s to be able to get a plane ticket to get to this conference so they could be in the mix of these other pieces. So that's what about becoming a champion of somebody who you see has the drive and the commitment and the talent, but not necessarily the resources and the network.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Join us next week on Collect Our Cousins, where every Thursday morning at 8 a.m., streaming live on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And thank you, everyone who tuned in today. Thank you so much, Steve, for joining us today. It was awesome to have you on.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
Okay, I'm going to end the broadcast.